Hi, everyone. My name is Preeti Desai, and I'm the Director of Social Media at the National Audubon Society. I'm also a nature and wildlife lover, and of course, a total bird nerd. And that's why today, on World Migratory Bird Day, it's my absolute pleasure to share the Zoom stage with two people whose work I greatly admire. First, somebody who probably needs no introduction if you've ever gone birdwatching even once, but I'll go ahead and do it anyway, just in case. I'm excited to introduce David Allen Sibley, renowned naturalist, author, and illustrator. You've likely seen his name splashed across this field guide that somebody was using to ID birds while outside. David has not only been birding since he was young, he's been drawing since he was young too. And thanks to that early love and practice, today David's work helps so many people figure out what the heck the tiny blobs that they're looking at through their binoculars are. Especially right now during spring migration, when many of us are craning our necks upwards to try to see the rainbow procession of warblers and other birds that are flying through. And here at Audubon, we've been immensely fortunate to have partnered with David for the illustrations in our online bird guide and several other projects over the years. So welcome, David.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
And you definitely know our next guest if you've ever wondered about the science behind bird brains. I'd like to introduce acclaimed science writer Jennifer Ackerman. Jennifer has been writing about science and nature for 3 decades and is the author of 8 books, of which 3, technically 4, are about birds. Her work aims to explain and interpret science for lay people like you and me, and her explorations into the world of birds have taken deep dives into questions of avian intelligence, behavior, abilities, and more. What I personally love about Jennifer's books is that they're fascinating, of course, and maybe I'm a little biased because who doesn't think birds are fascinating? But they're also accessible and interesting, even for people who aren't as captivated by birds. I've highlighted and sent friends passages from her latest book, and they're always asking to see more. Jennifer's passion and excitement for her subjects really shines through in her work. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
So, we're obviously all here today to talk about both of your new books that have just come out. But since today is World Migratory Bird Day, I thought it would be fun to start off by asking both of you to share your favorite story or anecdote about bird migration. David, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, I have always been just fascinated by migration. I think it's the thing that excites me most about bird watching. The places that I enjoy the most, like Cape May, New Jersey, but many places on the Atlantic coast or around the Great Lakes, just get tremendous migrations of birds, and seeing that flood of birds, or waking up one morning and suddenly being surrounded by thousands of birds of 30 different species that weren't there the day before. It's just a magical feeling. And the thought that the birds are making those journeys right now, and the birds that weigh only 7 grams, some just 5 grams, which is about as much as a nickel weighs. It's just amazing to think what they're doing. So I guess one of my favorite anecdotes was at Cape May in the 1990s, waking up early one morning and stepping outside and hearing great blue herons in October. And as the sky lightened up, this was clear that the sky was just filled with great blue herons. There were over 3,000 that day, that morning, all at once in the air over Cape May. Just an incredible migration spectacle, like nothing that has been seen before or since, but that's the magic of migration.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I'm lucky enough to live in New Jersey, so I have gotten to go to Cape May, and it's really incredible. I definitely encourage people, once we can, to check out Cape May if you can make it. Jennifer, what about you? What's one of your favorite stories?
Well, it's interesting. I lived in Lewis, Delaware, which is right across the ferry from Cape May, and one of my first experiences with the whole concept of a bird migrating to a very distant place and coming back with such precision to a nesting ground was with the ospreys around Lewis, Delaware. And that got me just so interested in this idea of how a migrating bird knows where it's going. And, they migrate to and from with this incredible precision. And even if they're thrown off course by, hundreds or thousands of miles. And I think that the story I wanted to share with you is actually it's a research story, but it just amazes me, and it concerns a flock of white-crowned sparrows on the West Coast, and the birds were migrating from their breeding grounds in Alaska and Canada to their wintering grounds in Mexico. And researchers in Washington State captured 30 of the birds, 15 adults and 15 juveniles, and they packed them into crates and they flew them by small aircraft all the way across the country to Princeton, New Jersey. And then they released them there to see if they could figure out their route back home. And it was astonishing. It just in a matter of hours, the adult birds were back on course, reorienting, set themselves directly for their wintering grounds in Mexico. And even the juvenile birds that had only, made this migratory journey once in their lives, they, set their bearings and headed straight for Mexico. And I just think that's astounding. And you think about this is going on in an animal with a brain the size of a nut. It's just amazing to me.
That's incredible. And I mean, that shows that we clearly have so much more to learn about these species. So David, let's go into your book. So your book, What It's Like to Be a Bird, came out less than a month ago. And I think it's a little different than your previous books in that it's essentially almost an encyclopedia on what birds are doing and why. I really loved when you said a bird's experience is far richer, more complex, and more thoughtful than I'd imagined. And I think that's what makes it perfect for folks right now, because a lot of the book is focused on common backyard or window birds that people are seeing while they're at home, and it can help people understand what they're seeing. So can you tell us about your new book?
Yeah, so the idea for it started out as a book for kids many years ago, and as the idea developed, it turned into more of a just a book about the amazing things that birds do, but I wouldn't call it an encyclopedia. It's not comprehensive at all. It's sort of the highlights or the things that caught my attention as I read about birds. And the things that I read about when I read Jennifer's book and many others and dug into the scientific research, and I thought I knew a lot about birds after 50 years of watching birds and writing about them. But as I started the research, got into the research and trying to answer some of the questions I was trying to answer for the book, I learned so much. Things that I thought I knew turned out to be wrong, and the reality was even more interesting, more fascinating, more amazing than what I thought was amazing before. So I have a few slides that I'll show some of the illustrations from the book and talk about just three of the most remarkable things, or well, there's many things that really surprised me as I went through the research, but I'll talk about three of those. So let me switch to my slides. So you should be seeing a killdeer on the screen.
Yep.
So I had never, killdeers they're camouflaged, cryptic coloration so that they're difficult to see on the ground. That protects them from predators. They're nesting on the ground in the open, and they rely on camouflage, on not being seen. But then I started to wonder what goes on at night when things like skunks and foxes are hunting. They're hunting by smell. It doesn't matter what the bird looks like. Well, it turns out that ground nesting birds like killdeers, in the nesting season, the chemical composition of the oil that they preen into their feathers changes to a chemical that is odorless, undetectable by mammals. And the researchers put samples of this breeding season preen oil with the regular preen oil in vials in a warehouse and let some hunting dogs in. And the dogs found the regular preen oil, but walked right by the breeding season preen oil without smelling it. And
Wow.
That's how killdeer, ducks, many ground nesting birds have this adaptation. And that was one of the first things I read about when I started working on this book that just blew my mind, that how did I not hear about that? The research is 20 or 30 years old. And so there's the killdeer's eggs, but it's the incubating bird that has the preen oil that's odorless. And then the next thing was, we talk about water off a duck's back. Feathers are waterproof, but I had always sort of assumed that it's the preen oil that makes the feathers waterproof, that the oil that the birds put onto their feathers is what is water repellent and keeps water from wetting the feathers. But it turns out that it's the structure of the feather. The spacing of the feather barbs is like Gore-Tex. So this is a feather on the left and a cross section of some of the barbs on the right with a drop of water suspended on top. And since the surface tension of the water holds it together in a drop, the spacing of the feather barbs is just right so that the drop is only making contact with a tiny surface area on the tops of the barbs. And it can't bend enough to make contact across the space between the barbs, and it can't get small enough to go through. So that's what actually makes feathers waterproof. And different species have different spacing of the barbs. You can tell by looking through a microscope and measuring the spacing of the barbs, you can tell whether a bird is one that dives underwater, where it needs to have the barbs closer together to prevent water from being forced through, or a land bird that just needs water to roll off of its feathers. They have barbs farther apart. And this, again, was just, I thought, I never knew that. And it means also that the little tiny hooks that hold the barbs together, they're not just there to hold the barbs from being pulled apart, but they're there to keep the barbs from being pushed too close together. Because if the barbs get too close together, then water can stick to the surface of 2 barbs or 3 barbs. So those little hooks, the barbules, are important to maintain the spacing, which makes the feathers waterproof. And the last thing is that gulls are known for eating garbage, literally, and for raiding picnics on the beach, eating junk food. But it turns out that when gulls are feeding their chicks, they make special trips to catch fresh fish, crabs, real food. And they bring that back to their chicks in the nest. So an adult gull might be traveling around. It might go to the garbage dump to get something for itself and then fly out into the bay or into the ocean and catch some fish and bring those back to its young. But they're very conscious about what they're feeding to their young. And chickadees, they feed their chicks mostly insect larvae, especially little green caterpillars, inchworms, things like that. They're not feeding their young sunflower seeds, even though the adults are probably visiting the feeder to fuel up on sunflower seeds themselves. Then they go into the forest and catch inchworms. But for the first week or so after the chicks hatch, the adult chickadees make a special effort to find spiders. And they feed their chicks a higher percentage of spiders. And it turns out spiders are high in taurine, which is an essential nutrient important for brain development. So instinctively, the chickadees know that spiders are really good for the first week, and then insect larvae. And once the chicks fledge and they're out on their own, then the adults will bring them to the sunflower seed feeder and show them where they can get an easy meal. But those are all the kinds of things that I learned. I kept running into, constantly running into these amazing, mind-blowing things that I had never known before. And that's what led me to write in the introduction that the birds' lives are so much richer, more complex than I ever imagined. So that's a quick summary of my book.
That's really cool. And I love how the adults are like, no junk food for you until you're older.
That's right. Yeah, when you're old enough.
Yeah.
When you can fly, you can have sunflower seeds.
That's great. And I was reading the section that you had on robins and their nest cycle, because I have a lot of them in my backyard, and that was fascinating to me. So yeah, just learning those little facts just, I think, makes going birding that much more of a richer experience.
Yeah.
So Jennifer, your new book, The Bird Way, A New Look at How Birds Talk, Work, Play, Parent, and Think, just came out earlier this week. And I think David alluded to this earlier, but it strikes me that it's actually a great companion read to what it's like to be a bird. You cover a lot more ground in that the book takes us across the world, but The Bird Way also aims to take us deeper into the world of bird behavior and abilities. I can see people reading about some of the topics that David covers and wanting to know more, and that's where they can reach for your book. So can you tell us a little bit more about The Bird Way?
Absolutely. And I just want to say, I've read David's book and it's just utterly delightful. It's so full of incredible information and lively facts, and the illustrations are gorgeous. I'm particularly fond of the section on corvids, and he has a beautiful illustration of two ravens preening, and you think of them as such dour, sober birds, and there they are just being so tender. So beautiful, beautiful book.
Oh, thank you.
So yes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Bird Way. So this book really explores some of the exciting new discoveries in bird science that have changed the way that and overturned old ideas about how birds conduct their lives. And this is really a thrilling time in bird science that I think in recent years, our view of birds has really just shifted radically. For one thing, we used to think that birds had brains that were so small and simple, they were really capable of only the simplest mental processes. And now we know otherwise. We know that a bird's brain is actually this kind of miracle of miniaturization. It's really dense with neurons, it's highly efficient, and it's capable of just the most astonishing mental feats. So take, for example, the Rufous Hummingbird. So this bird, it can recall not only the location of a particular flower on which it fed, but it can also remember when it fed on that particular flower and won't return to it until the flower has replenished its nectar. So the hummingbird stores this when and where information about hundreds of flowers in a brain that's only the size of a grain of rice. So the Birdway, it looks at how birds use intelligence and ingenuity in their daily activities. So in socializing, communicating, finding food, courting, mating, raising their young, and surviving in difficult and challenging circumstances. It also explores the exuberant variety of behaviors in the bird world. And it tells stories about some of them, the more unusual and extraordinary things that birds do. Because as it turns out that unusual behavior is often intelligent behavior. It's innovative behavior. It's birds doing, finding a new way to solve an old problem. And this kind of behavior, these sort of startling and surprising behaviors, they can actually tell us a lot about what birds are capable of doing. So I'm going to share a few examples from the book. This is a New Holland honeyeater of Australia, and it's a bird that's toppling old ideas about how much information birds can convey in their calls and songs. So when this bird spots a hawk or another threat, it lets loose with an alarm call that's just packed with information. So this call tells other birds what kind of predator is coming, where it's arriving from, how far away it is, how fast it's moving, when to dive for cover, and also when it's okay to come out of hiding again. And, this sort of thing, it makes you really wonder, well, what are we missing in other bird calls? And the really cool thing is that different species of birds understand the details of the honeyeater's warning message, and they heed its call. So really, birds can understand foreign languages. Uh, so scientists have learned a lot lately about how birds can make and use their own sophisticated tools. And one of the birds that I look at or a set of birds in the birdway are firehawks, which are showing us that birds may be capable of using fire as a tool. So, you know, raptors all over the world, they hunt at wildfires. They go after the critters that are fleeing from the flames. And so, you know, it's one thing to feed at a fire that's already active, but it's another thing, something else altogether, to start a fire of your own. And that's what some of these Australian raptors seem to be doing. They are flying into active fires, picking up smoldering embers, and then carrying them away, dropping them in unburned areas of grass and brush, and starting new fires there. So it's really startling behavior that's kind of breaking down another one of those barriers that's separating humans from other species. You know, we thought we were the only species that used fire as a tool. The theme in my book is how birds work together in extraordinary ways to meet the challenges of daily living. And the greater Ani is a tropical cuckoo that gathers together in groups of up to a dozen adults to raise its young. And the group members are not related. They're basically strangers, and yet they work together closely and expertly to build a nest together, to warm the eggs, to look out for predators, and to feed the young until they fledge. So the real question is, well, how do these birds coordinate all this activity? Well, they do it through remarkable daily huddles. And several times a day, these birds gather in a cluster and they start to chorus in unison. And I'm going to let you hear a little of it here. I hope you could hear that. Anyway,
Yeah.
scientists believe that the car sync may be how the birds make their decisions together. So where do we build a nest? Who's ready to lay eggs? Who's going to guard the chicks tonight? It's a remarkable example of avian ingenuity in achieving teamwork. But the prize for bird cooperation may go to this parrot, the kea, which is the world's most playful and mischievous bird. In their native New Zealand, kea are known as clowns of the mountains because they are so cheeky and destructive, and they're apt to disassemble your satellite dish or strip all the rubber from your car. And, you know, they're really more like small children than birds. They run up to you like you're the favorite aunt at the family gathering, and they just explore every inch of your body, and they'll hop up on your shoulders and they'll jump on your head and pull your hair. It's utterly charming. They're also incredibly smart, and they have a genius for working together to solve problems. So we know this from experimental tests like this one, which is a box that has, it's rigged with 4 separate chains, and the chains have to be pulled simultaneously in order for the platform to drop and to release the treats. And it's really not an easy task for any animal, but kea ace the tests. They wait until everybody gets positioned, then yank the chains all at once so everyone gets their treats.
Wow.
So these birds, another remarkable thing, they never fight. Instead, everyone plays, you know, young and old alike. And they even have a special warbling play call that they use to summon other kea to play. And scientists suspect that kea actually use play to keep peace in their flocks. So the idea is, you know, having a conflict or, you know, vying for social status, then just warble a play call and all will be well. You know, laugh and the world will laugh with you.
We could take some lessons from Kia's, huh?
Truly. So I hope people will enjoy the stories in this book. They're really tales about how we've learned about these birds and their extraordinary ways. And I also hope that that reading the book will be a little bit like getting a new pair of binoculars, that it will make people see the birds around them in a different way. The crows, wrens, vultures, seabirds, hummingbirds, to see them a little differently, like the clever, creative, and really innovative creatures that they are. So I just wanted to thank the people that contributed photos, and thank everybody for listening.
That's really great. I mean, there's just so much information packed into your book. One question that I was wondering about is, you point out in this book how much of our knowledge of birds has been rooted in research done on species in North America and Europe. And that's such an easy way to bias the results that come out of that research. But you do talk about the work that's now being conducted more broadly and how that's changing a lot of our previously held ideas about birds. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so I think there are three reasons that some of these revelations are coming out now, and one of the big ones is that we're sort of shedding the biases that we've had, and we've had sensory biases, we've had gender biases, and we've had geographical biases, and I think that the fact that most research, ornithological research, has been done in temperate regions of the northern hemisphere has really skewed our view of what's normal in birds, what's usual and what's unusual. You know, we sort of have this idea that birds breed in pairs, that they migrate, that males defend their territory, primarily males sing, and well, it turns out that that's actually not the rule. Those things are much more exceptions. And now that researchers are looking at birds in the tropics and in other parts of the world, those northern lenses are kind of falling away, and we're beginning to see the bigger picture of how birds behave in the larger world.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. We'll just start learning more and more, you know, as more research is done.
Mm-hmm.
I think this question is maybe for both of you. With so much information available and so much research being done, how do you decide what to include and what not to include in your books, and then David, in your drawings?
Yeah, for me, it was sort of whatever caught my fancy. I had a limited amount of space. Well, any book, you have a limited amount of space. So at a limited amount of time, I tried to highlight the things, a diversity, a broad range of things. So that was part of my my thought process or my decision process, and also trying to answer the most common or most widespread questions I thought of that. But really, it just came down to my own personal preferences. If I thought something was really cool, I would include it in the book, and try to find a way to work it in. And I kept learning new things that I thought really needed to be in there, and finding a way to squeeze that in as like one sentence in another essay, just to get that little fact in there somewhere. But yeah, that's always a challenge with a book for me. It's just figuring out what will fit and how to fit it in.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you have tried to fit in as much as you can, because that also serves as a springboard for people to do more research if they want to know more.
Yeah.
Jennifer?
Yeah, for me, it's like David. It's very idiosyncratic. It's kind of what draws my attention. I also just look for the really good stories, and you know what, partly about the birds themselves, but also about the researchers who study them. And you know, and I love to spend time with researchers who are really passionate about their work, and you know, do crazy, dangerous things to really expand our knowledge of birds. So you know, I had a I had a huge list of topics that I wanted to cover, birds and researchers that I wanted to cover in this book. And, you know, you do have to be selective. But the the beautiful thing is that there's just endless material, and you know, I'm excited about writing more about birds in the future. So
Yeah, that's one thing I noticed, Jennifer. You've written a lot of books, but I think at least 3 or 4 have been about birds. So clearly you have an interest in that. Yeah. Um, Actually, Jennifer, you talking about your research, you know, you've gotten time to spend with researchers in the field through, you know, this book and for your previous book. Are there some good stories that you've gotten out of those experiences that you want to share?
yeah, sure. You know, one of my favorite experiences was was with Jessica McLaughlin, who studies the honey eater, and she's a remarkable person. I mean, what we've learned about the honey eater has come out of incredibly meticulous work that she's done with video and audio um, recordings and playback studies, but she is renowned for being a really great field biologist. And basically, what she has to do is go out in the field and stay perfectly still to capture the behaviors and the alarm calls. And she has some great stories about like being in the field and recording, and she feels something crawling up her chest, and she says, "No, it's all right. It's okay. It's probably just a leaf, you know, something moving." And you know, it starts to move again, and it gets a little bit closer to her chin, and she looks down, and it's a huntsman spider, which is just, you know, an arachnophobe's nightmare. It's like 5 inches in width, and venomous, and you know, she managed to get the thing off, but she is so devoted to her work that and I found this, you know, throughout, that particularly the researchers in Australia are you know, they're just kind of facing stuff in the field all the time that's spooky, like eastern brown snakes that, you know, will have the highest fatality rate of any snake in Australia. And the researcher that I was with, who studies brood parasites in outside of Brisbane, and he, you know, his field is just full. His field site is full of eastern brown snakes. So um, yeah, so I mean, I think that, you know, being with those people, hearing their stories was a thrill. And, you know, and just getting to see some of the birds myself, like the superb lyrebird, and, you know, in full song in a rainforest in Australia was just magnificent.
Yeah, that's really cool. I've seen video recordings of the amazing, I guess, mimicry that they can do, and that's really cool.
Yeah.
Um, we're getting a lot of questions about David's art process. So David, can you talk about what your illustration process is like, especially in regard to gathering references and making sure that you depict each bird accurately? Are you drawing from photos, or are you out in the field, or can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I say the most important part of my artistic process is the years in the field watching birds and doing field sketches, and just over and over um, doing a sketch, watching some more birds. And when you look back at the sketch a day or a week or a year later, you can see, after having seen many more of that species, you see what's wrong with the sketch, what you didn't get quite right, even though it seemed perfect at the time that you drew it. So that sort of trial and error experience of drawing the birds over and over in the field from life, I think is really a key. And now when so in the field, I just do pencil sketches, and I would say 95% of my time is just watching, and then a little bit of time doing pencil sketches. And those sketches are mostly, I use them in the studio, but they're mostly just sort of inspiration or refresher of what the bird looked like, how I drew it successfully in the field. Then I can look at photographs and use those as my main reference material for getting the colors and patterns right. But photographs are misleading and can be misleading in many different ways. So that's where the field experience comes back to be to allow me to kind of pick and choose or to interpret the photograph and turn it into a painting that looks right. And for these species that I know really well, it's mostly a process of working on a painting, checking the photograph to check, or I have a bunch of photographs usually that I'm working from, checking those to make sure I'm getting the details right, to check some, does the black come up over the bill a little bit or not? And then just kind of sitting back and looking at it, or hanging it on the wall for a couple of days and looking at it, and seeing if it still looks right. Or I'll sometimes walk into the room after 3 days of the painting being hung up on the wall, and suddenly notice something that like, oh, well, the bill's too small, or the eye's in the wrong place, or something, and try to fix that. But it's just sort of eyeballing, and it all goes back to that the years that I spent in the field in the 80s and 90s, just birding full time and sketching. Yeah, really getting to know the birds.
Yeah. So we actually have a question from a 12-year-old named David, who says his mom said I could watch your presentation. He wants to be an ornithologist, and he also likes illustrating. So he wants to know, how do you draw your birds so amazing?
Well, I would say it's practice and lots of time watching birds. And really, there's a quote that I like in a book by Peter Steinhardt, and the book is called The Undressed Art. It's about why we draw. And he said, a drawing is a picture of your understanding, which is it really rings true to me, that if you understand something, you can draw it. And then the process of drawing forces you to to figure things out. You're converting something that's 3 dimensions and moving, living, breathing bird into a few lines on a sheet of paper, and finding the right lines, figuring out how to convert that 3-dimensional thing into a few lines on a sheet of paper is really, that's the real challenge. And I'd say it really doesn't matter so much if your sketches are right, if they come out looking right. If they come out looking wrong, then you just try to figure out what went wrong, or look at the birds some more, and sooner or later you'll find the right lines, you'll find the answer. Yeah. Sketching is all about the process, and like I said, I don't use my sketches so much as in the studio. The value was in the time I spent in the field just doing those sketches. So drawing is the way to figure things out, to develop, to really understand what a bird looks like. Just keep drawing.
That's great advice. I think for anything, if you're trying to be a better artist, a better birder, just keep doing it and you'll get better.
Yeah.
Jennifer, this may seem a little out of left field, but in your research, have you found a connection between birds and art? For example, we know that male bowerbirds decorate their bowers to attract females, but can birds be artists?
Well, I think it depends on how you define art, but and how, what you define as beautiful. But I certainly think that bowerbirds have an aesthetic sense, and I have no idea whether they find their bowers as beautiful as I do, but they really are extraordinary in terms of their ability to create beautiful structures in the bower itself, and then to decorate with objects. There was one spotted bowerbird that actually built its bower near the house of a stained glass artist, and the bird had shards of glass in its bower arranged by color. So it looked like this, amazing little mosaic. And, I think that's, in my view, that's a pretty good example of art. And yeah, I think these birds have an amazing aesthetic sense.
That's great. David, going back to you, still within this theme, you know, so many people separate art from science, but your work over the years has focused on both. Can you talk about the connection between the two?
Yeah, my so my work is all about information. So it's really, I would consider it scientific illustration. It's about, and that's always the way I've approached it. I was sketching birds in the field to try to learn about them and to record what I was learning, to record the sort of technical differences between species. And so that, and there's a lot of debate about the difference between art and illustration. I would put my work squarely in the illustration category. But I would, I'll use that as an opportunity to talk about the importance of illustration in general as an art form, as a way of conveying information. There is no substitute for illustration. Photographs cannot substitute for illustration. And the way that an illustrator can take a complex thing and simplify it into a few lines or simple colors and patterns makes it so much easier to understand. It's sort of the illustrator goes to the work of understanding something and converting it into a much simpler pattern, and then it's easy for you to understand. Whereas a photograph is just recording exactly what's there and reproducing it, not interpreting it at all, not simplifying it or understanding it, just showing you what it looks like. And I think that illustration is an incredibly important and valuable thing that I'm a little concerned in the digital age if illustration, photography becomes so easy and widespread that illustration will fade away. But at the same time, I keep meeting people who love illustration and are doing it. There's a lot of satisfaction in it, so I think it will continue. But I just wanted to make the point that I think it's a really important art form.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, I'm a hobbyist photographer myself. I love to take pictures of birds, but half of my pictures of birds are birds behind sticks. So I definitely think that the illustrations are still key. So we have a question. I think this will be for both of you. What's the most common misconception that people have about birds?
Ooh.
Well, one thing that I would offer is, comes out of this northern bias, northern hemisphere bias, which is that many of us in this country in particular think that it's primarily male birds that sing complex songs. And it really turns out that in 2/3 of songbird species, females sing, and they sing songs just as complex and for similar purposes as males do. And I certainly grew up thinking that if I heard a bird singing, it was a male bird, and it was defending its territory or seeking a mate. And so it was really interesting to me to discover that female song was so widespread in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I still think that misconception exists. I mean, I didn't realize until fairly recently that that's not the case. And I think books like yours, Jennifer, will hopefully change everybody's commonly held misconceptions.
Yeah, I've been hearing since I moved to central Massachusetts a few years ago. I've been focusing a lot more on learning all the sounds of the common species that are right here around our house, and so hearing a lot of different vocalizations that I didn't hear before, or didn't really pay that much attention to before. And one thing that's really striking is that the species like red-winged blackbird, the females sing, but not like the males. They have a completely different vocalization that they use on the nesting territory. It's just as complex and intricate and and noticeable as the male song, but it's completely different. They have so, and I think that's true in quite a few other species as well. The females, they don't necessarily sing like the males. They're singing their own song, and but a very complex and meaningful song. I would say that one of the most common misconceptions that I hear from non-birders is that they've seen a little tiny bird at their feeder and they think it's a baby. So the misconception that a small bird must be a baby of the common species, where as soon as by the time a bird leaves the nest, by the time it's flying, they're all the same size. They are full adult sized when they leave the nest, and that's it's unlike mammals, and so I think that's where the misconception comes from. But I guess I would go on, if I can add another one, just the sense that birds are sort of automatons, simplistic and acting on instinct. And this is the whole point of Jennifer's book, and the thing that I came to appreciate through my work on my book, that there's a whole lot going on. There's decisions being made all the time, and adjustments, and things like an aesthetic sense, and a sense, I really believe there's a sense of pride and satisfaction and anxiety and all those things going on in a bird's mind in some respect, not necessarily the way we feel those things, but I think that the way that the complexity of the things they're doing has to be motivated and moderated by some really subtle thing like feelings. It's not just instinct telling them the day length is 12 hours and 3 minutes, it's time to build a nest. Find this material and put it together this way. Anyway, that's I think a lot of people still think of birds as just little robots hopping around acting on instinct, and it's very far from true.
Yeah. Jennifer, would you add anything to that? I mean, your previous book was really focused on a lot of that.
Absolutely. I mean, we've learned so much about the bird brain itself, and that, it really is it packs a punch for the size that it is. Mm-hmm. And it may not have the layers of cortex that our smart brains have, and bird brains are wired differently, but they are really, really efficient, and they really are capable of very, very sophisticated mental feats. And I think the other thing that I would add to what David's saying, I couldn't agree with him more, is the idea that birds learn. And we have so much believed that that so much of bird behavior was driven by instinct, and that birds really weren't capable of complex learning. Well, even something like nest building now, we understand, is not just genetically hardwired. That birds get better at it, and they choose materials, and they choose size based on temperature, and they're making, just as David said, all of these decisions, and based on experience, based on observation, and just much more complicated thought processes than we ever gave them credit for.
Yeah, and everybody check out Jennifer's previous book to learn more about that. I think we have time for one more question. We actually got two that are sort of related, so I'll posit both of these to you. Did writing your books give you more hope for the survival of birds in the face of human behavior? And are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of bird conservation across the world?
Mm.
It's such a mixed bag. I mean, I think this is a very difficult moment. I just would like to say on World Migratory Bird Day that the rollback of some of the environmental regulations and the gutting of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which has been in place for almost 50 years, is really devastating, and I think is going to have a huge impact on migratory birds. I think the statistics are that as many as 1 billion could be killed because of the rollbacks of these regulations. And so that kind of thing is very disheartening. You know, I do, I believe, you know, birds have been around for a very long time, much longer than we have, and many of them are very, very adaptable species. But we have a lot of work to do in terms of limiting climate change and habitat loss and all the other things that are threatening so many birds. So you know, I'd like to be optimistic. I do think birds are incredibly persistent and resilient, but we're certainly putting them to the test.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, and I would say that I think to be optimistic, I would say that I think birds are so resilient that they will survive anything that comes along. You know, when you talk about issues like climate change, some species of birds will be devastated by that. Most species will adapt. They will shift, their ranges will shift, and that's been happening for forever. Nothing, over long periods of time, the bird populations are not stable, bird species are not stable. So this is all sort of part of the process. It's accelerated right now with climate change, but I guess my point is that climate change is a human issue, and I think it's very much a bird issue. We should be focused on saving these species that are going to be drastically affected by climate change. But by the time those birds are really in trouble, the human population is also going to be facing some really severe impacts from climate change and sea level rise and all those things. So birds will be, I think birds will adapt, and most of the species will do fine. We do have, I think we have a responsibility, I think, to give them space to share this planet, to let them live their lives, and to make room for them, and tackle problems like climate change that are having dramatic impacts. But the human population is going to feel impacts as well.
Certainly. And, you know, there's definitely lots of organizations like Audubon, like American Bird Conservancy, at least in the US, and then globally beyond that, that are working on a lot of those issues. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act, Jennifer, here in the US, that's something that is very important for us. And with climate change, you know, Audubon put out the climate report last year called Survival by Degrees, where we looked at the effect of climate change on many bird species, and a lot of them are in trouble. So I think we all have a lot of work to do to ensure that we can continue sharing the world with birds and other wildlife as well. So that's the end of our time. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today. I think everybody has learned a lot, and I think we've whetted their appetites so that you guys can go out and buy The Bird Way by Jennifer Ackerman and What It's Like to Be a Bird by David Allen Sibley. And I will pass it back to John. Thank you.
Thanks, Preeti. Just wanted to say thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, David. It's been a really interesting conversation. And thank you, Preeti, and everyone at the National Audubon Society. And thanks to everyone watching. You've been a really great audience. We had lots of great questions coming in and comments in the chat. Just to let you know, I'll be sending around a follow-up email through Eventbrite with a link to a recording of today's event. And yeah, like you were saying, you can find David's and Jennifer's wonderful books wherever books are sold. So thanks, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.